John 12, 1-8. 6 days before the Passover, Jesus came to Bethany, the home of Lazarus, whom he had raised from the dead. There they gave a dinner for him. Martha served, and Lazarus was one of those at the table with him. Mary took a pound of costly perfume made of pure nard, anointed Jesus' feet, and wiped them with her hair. The house was filled with the fragrance of the perfume. But Judas Iscariot, one of his disciples, the one who was about to betray him, said, "Why was this perfume not sold for 300 denarii and the money given to the poor?" He said this not because he cared about the poor, but because he was a thief. He kept the common purse and used to steal what was put into it. Jesus said, "Leave her alone. She bought it so that she might keep it for the day of my burial. You always have the poor with you, but you do not always have me."
There's a way of reading today's story that can make us squirm a little, right? Mary spends the equivalent, I'm told, of 1 year's salary on perfume of all things. Then Mary starts dumping that perfume on feet of all things. And in fact, Mary dumps that perfume on Jesus' feet of all things. And so the squirmy questions start right there, don't they? Like, is perfuming a feet really a thing? Like, is washing my feet and putting clean socks on every day not enough for everyone? Do my feet stink? I've just become nose blind to it? Don't answer that. But seriously, so many actual theologically squirmy questions come up, like, is Jesus really encouraging us to spend money on decadence like super expensive perfume? That seems so contrary to everything else Jesus teaches, right? Like, does this passage reveal that the prosperity gospel people have it right? That we should be teaching that if you love Jesus enough, you too will earn enough to buy the best luxury items money could buy. That maybe our outreach committee should be spending more time making sure we're all at Macy's taking glamorous selfies of ourselves, spritzing ourselves with Chanel No. 5, and posting them on Instagram, #blessed. Then there's the fact that Mary lavishes this all on Jesus, right? I mean, this is the guy who told us, what you do for the least of these, you do for me. And now Mary's pouring liquid money on his feet, and Judas, who pretty much always feels like an unsympathetic character to me in the Gospels, except for this moment, is like, Lord, shouldn't we be giving this to the poor? And now Jesus seems to be like, nah, she's supposed to give it to me. Squirmy questions, right? Is there maybe something more going on here? Something more consistent with the rest of the gospel, with Jesus' teachings about generosity and caring for the less privileged and the vulnerable? Well, yes, I believe there is, and let's begin with unpacking it this way. Today's theme, as you've already noticed, invites us to move from a mentality of scarcity to a mentality of abundance, with the idea being that we tend to assume that we live in a world of scarcity, in a world where there isn't enough to go around, when actually God is pointing us towards living like there is more than enough to go around. To, for example, on just a very small level, be that person in a full coffee shop who, with all the tables taken, who's just gotten their coffee and is relieved to see a table finally open up at just that moment. But then, instead of claiming it for themselves, remembers that older couple they saw wandering around looking a little disoriented at the fact that there were no tables available, and then instead waves them over to the empty table, trusting maybe another table will open up, or even if it doesn't, maybe something other something else that's wonderful, something totally unexpected could happen because you didn't get a table. Who knows, right? Who knows what we might receive if we live like there is abundance and not scarcity? And that sure seems to be part of what Jesus is praising here, right? A mentality, unlike Judas is, a mentality that isn't about limiting generosity because we think there's scarcity, but rather a mentality that is unusually generous and open to receiving generosity because we trust that God gives us in abundance. Our way is to live like there's scarcity, but God's way is to remind us that we can be generous because our Creator blesses the world with abundance. So that feels a little more consistent with the rest of Jesus' message, right? But in case some of those squirmy questions are still hanging around for you, let's also observe 3 more specifics in this story that we might miss the first time we read it. Observations that can move us from worrying that all this abundance talk, when considered in the context of this story, might lead us to spending all of our money on decadence or on symbolic acts for Jesus only. Let's call them observations about God's way of abundance. And observation number 1. Start with a question. The puppets brought it up. Who is doing the decadent giving here? Is it the male disciples who have a lot of power and privilege and comfort at this gathering? No, right? It's Mary, who is a woman in a patriarchal culture, who is clearly vulnerable to criticism from all these men around her. I mean, Judas sure doesn't hesitate to immediately scold her publicly, does he? I suspect that those of us here who have more money and privilege tend to superimpose ourselves onto Mary when we read this story, to think as if we are Mary here. But truthfully, in terms of socioeconomic status in the church family, those of us with more power are more like the disciples in this story. Those of us might want to ask ourselves this question: what do we in the church with more power and privilege tend to do when someone in the church with less power, privilege, and probably even money wants to share a gift, maybe even a decadent gift, with the body? Sometimes, can our first instinct be to critique it, to, like Judas, think of all the ways in which it's not a good idea? Maybe your first instinct is to think no. It's easy to think, no, I'd never do that. I'd just be so happy to receive it. And I'm sure that's often true. But I remind myself to consider what I once heard an indigenous Mennonite say to all of the delegates at a Mennonite Church USA convention. He said, "Believe me, you'll know when another culture is really embracing the gospel because you hate what they've done with it." That's not just something that happens between Christians of different skin colors, is it? It's something that I know applies to the different experiences we have and tastes we develop based on our socioeconomic differences too. What if someone wants to share a gift of music in a style that didn't match your sensibilities? To paint a diorama across the front of the sanctuary that was in an artistic style that you and all your closest friends couldn't stand? To gift us most of their money to add something to the church that you and most of the people you talked to during the week found ostentatious? I'm not saying that there shouldn't be any communal discernment on what we sing, paint, add, or build, but my point is that this story can remind us that those of us with more might want to sometimes make sure we're checking our inner Judases, to seek and first and foremost to be places where we all can share abundantly the gifts that we've brought to share, not just have those with the most do all the choosing. Because all too often, under the guise of generosity, churches can become places where those with the most money and power get to perform their generosity in a way that allows them to also stay in control and in charge of what's sung, painted, added, built, done, etc. Today's story just challenges us to avoid and correct that, Today's story points us back towards accepting the true abundance that God wants to give us. Okay, observation number 2 about God's way of abundance. And I'm going to speed up a bit here because I want to leave lots of room for our confessor today. Observation number 2, to cut to the chase, is that Mary's giving is really raw, really salt of the earth stuff, really real and quite vulnerable. John's gospel, you may have noticed already, emphasizes the gritty, intimate, physical, vulnerable side of Jesus' life and interactions with us in this world. He rubs his own spit and mud on someone's eyes. The beloved disciple reclines on his chest. He scrubs feet in the middle of a meal. And here, Mary rubs perfume into his feet with her hair. John's gospel is a beautiful, even if sometimes uncomfortable, reminder that Jesus' ways are often earthy ways, raw, real, salt of the earth, vulnerable stuff. And when it comes to this moment of sharing abundantly, we might want to remind ourselves to look for that in our church family too. How do we know whether a valuable gift that's being shared is decadence for the sake of decadence or decadence for Jesus? Well, one question might be to ask, does the sharing of that gift create opportunities for us to be more real and vulnerable with one another, like Mary was with Jesus? If so, there may be more abundance in that gift than we even at first recognize. Finally, observation number 3 about God's ways of abundance. To get to it, let's ask, while Mary's decadent gift at first seems to only be for Jesus, is it really? That question cuts to the heart of the fear that I know some of us carry, that this story encourages Christians to spend their money on symbolic gestures for Jesus rather than on struggling people around us. And in response, I just want to point out one short sentence that's easy to miss here. The way the Bible was edited, it doesn't even get a verse to itself. It's a part B of a verse, but it's this: the house was filled with the fragrance of the perfume. It's the last thing written before Judas gets testy. Think of it like this: and the house was filled with the fragrance of the perfume, but Judas said. That brief moment, that turn from the positive of what's happening to the negative response from Judas pivots on this: the fact that Mary's gift to Jesus was becoming a gift to the whole room, to everyone present. It doesn't say, and the perfume was making Jesus really happy, but Judas said. It is emphasizing that what Mary did for Jesus was a gift to everyone. And that's what Judas interrupts. That's what the text builds this gift up to be, an offering to Jesus that is doing something for everyone. So, when it comes to God's way of sharing and abundance, we might want to remind ourselves to watch for that too. When someone in our church family or the broader church family is offering us something, perhaps something quite vulnerable, valuable, was offering something to Jesus, perhaps quite valuable, is it possible that it's also a gift for many others too? Is it possible that sincere gifts for Jesus tend to be gifts that benefit others too? So maybe that's one way to evaluate whether a gift someone gives for Jesus is the kind of thing that Jesus would really call us to give. Do the benefits of that gift have the potential to ripple out to others too? And maybe it's also a check on those of us with a heart for those with less, who like to criticize any giving that's done with an emphasis on Jesus. When we're quick to criticize like that, we might miss the potential impact that gift could have when it ripples out to others. It's possible that we can miss out on some of how God's ways of abundance work beyond what we expect. All of which is to say, and to bring these observations together, is that God's way of abundance? It's this: that God's way of abundance can invite us to make more room for more people to give. It can invite us to open ourselves to gifts that make us more honest, open, vulnerable, and real with each other. And it can tear down the false dichotomy we may want to create between giving to Jesus and giving to others. Our mentality of scarcity says, in order to make sure we get as much as possible or as much as possible to those who need it, we'd better have a firm control on who gives, what they give, and how they give it. But meanwhile, God invites us to something much more spacious and gracious, saying, watch me multiply how many in your midst you can recognize as gift givers. Watch me multiply the diversity of gifts you could receive. Watch me open you up to knowing one another vulnerably across differences. Watch me show you true gifts to me that can ripple out as gifts for everyone. Watch me draw you into my way of abundance. So, now, with all of that said, I want to invite you into the second part of today's message, the story sharing that we're acknowledging as confession through Lent. And I'd like to call up Brent Kaufman, who has a story to share and describes one of the ways in which he was reoriented by God, going from fears about scarcity to an experience of abundance. Come on up, Brent. You can go right over to that mic there. Thanks, Brent, for doing this. It's good to have you up here with me. When I put these themes in the bulletin, you immediately mentioned to me a time in your life where you had expected scarcity and experienced abundance. Do you want to tell us about what that transition was and what you felt called to at that time?
Yeah, thank you for the opportunity to share. And I would just give you as a background here in that it's just kind of embarrassing to admit, but it's the honest truth. And so in the early 80s, Debbie and I were living in Montana, and I loved to play sports. And so most of my connection with the church family in Montana was I didn't want them to forget about me when it was time to play basketball or softball or volleyball. That's the harsh reality. But
yeah.
That was there. Anyway, Deborah and I and our two daughters were involved in a very serious car accident in September of '82. And I would say that the church response in Kalispell was the church at its very best. They loved us, they embraced us, they held us, they pulled us close. And I would say through this experience, we became involved in the church. And so, first of all, was just showing up regularly. That was the main thing. But loved and supported through that. I would say also, I was in the hospital in Washington for 6 weeks, and I received cards and letters every day except one day. Well, not kind of the first couple days, but after that, cards and letters every day, just the church expressing compassion for us and that kind of thing. Anyway, through being involved with the church, through the next 7 or 8 years, became involved with it, and the pastor there, Ray Landis, saw that I had some potential for leadership, and so encouraged me. And then, anyway, we were invited to do a part of a ministry, another opportunity, a ministry, and we had kind of put the, to use biblical language, put a fleece before the Lord. And the housing market in Montana at that time was pretty hot. And we only had one person that came and looked at our house. Nobody bought it. And so we said, well, evidently we are supposed to do this. And then Howard Kine from Kansas had called me and said, hey, we have this pastoral ministry program. Are you interested? Could you come visit and that kind of stuff? Anyway, we put our house back on the market, and it sold almost instantly. And so, yeah, we had a very, I would say that the opportunity was there.
Well, thanks. When you first arrived there, what did it, so it was Heston, right? You said, no.
Correct, in
Heston.
Kansas,
Okay.
yeah.
So when you first arrived at Heston, what did it feel like? Did you still have worries about how everything was going to go and how your family was going to do, if there's going to be enough? What was that like?
Yeah, yes, absolutely. Debbie and I both had very good jobs in Montana and had been in, Debbie worked at an insurance office and I worked for a civil engineering land surveying firm, and we had great jobs. And so it was and we didn't have any debt going into Kansas. Our vehicles were paid off, and we had sold our house, and still we'd only visited this place once. And I had a part-time surveying job that I knew was going to be in Kansas, and Debbie was able to work in the Heston College's food service in the kitchen there.
Yeah. What are some of the things that happened after that spoiler revealed God's ways of abundance to you?
Yeah, one of the more interesting parts, and probably not everybody's going to see us exciting, and we at the point didn't think it was all that exciting, but Debbie, when she worked in the college kitchen, you can serve a a menu, and then you can warm it up once, and then by regulation, you have to throw it all out. You can't serve it anymore. Well, people in the kitchen could actually take this stuff home. So Debbie and I had lots and lots and lots of leftovers. And it doesn't sound super appetizing, but, it actually, theologically, we were not wasting anything. We all, he actually fed our neighbors too. So lots of the other pastoral ministry students, we'd get these ginormous pans of chicken cacciatore and lasagna and all this kind of stuff. We'd just say, come to the Kaufman house, bring your containers in. We'd load up people and send them home. So.
Yeah, thanks, Brent. It reminds me of the part where I was studying for this message, and I looked at that one line I'd missed before that talked about how when we receive God's abundance, it can also spread out to more and more people.
Yeah.
Do you want to say more about how that was your experience too?
Yeah, just so the part of the blessing is that we received this blessing for us. So, we were there for a couple of years, and we really went in with no debt. But we were in school full time for 2 years, and when we came out of there, we only had $5,000 worth of debt of just being there and working. So a great blessing. And I would say also that just using the gifts that were there, and we were able also to share, kind of like you were talking earlier with the loaves and the fishes. When you bring to Jesus or when you share, there's just a lot of blessings in.
Yeah.
We formed many friendships that we still have today while we were there.
Yeah.
So.
Anything else you want to say about your story or experience?
Well, I would just say also that looking back, eating all the food together with that time in our family life was probably the leanest time or the least income that Debbie and I ever had in our married life. And yet, both Debbie and I and our daughters would say that it was probably some of the richest time or the richest years of our lives in the friendships that we formed and the fun that we had together. And, I think, had we stayed in Montana and I'd have stayed in the engineering and surveying world and Debbie would have stayed there, we would have made a lot more money. And yet I would say that our lives were greatly enriched by being willing to offer this and being accepted into this. Our lives were greatly enriched by that opportunity.
So it was both that Heston experience, but then also set you up for a different kind of abundance for life.
Yeah, correct. So, coming to Oregon and the humorous part too is, and this, if you live in Oregon, you understand this, but many of my other friends in the Pastoral Ministries program, when we got a call to come and go to Lebanon for a visit, they said, well, why would you want to go out there? And actually, the humorous part is that before I actually agreed to go to Heston's program, I have relatives in Iowa, I have relatives in Kansas, and I had been to that part, and I knew that there were a lot more churches in the Pennsylvania, Ohio, Indiana, Iowa, Kansas, and so our chances of coming to that, and after I surrendered that to God and said, well, you'll put me where I need to be, we got invited back to Oregon. So none of my other students thought going to Oregon was crazy, and it was exactly what I had most dreamed. So.
Well, that's beautiful. Thanks for sharing that all with us, Brent. Would you be willing to exercise those pastoral chops and lead us through our collective reading of confession today?
Yeah. So there's a confession in your bulletin, and I will read the leader portion and invite you to follow with the people portion. Holy One, we seek you while you still may be found.
We call upon you while you are near.
Have mercy on us, O God, for our thoughts are not your thoughts, and our ways are not your ways.
Forgive us for believing the myth of scarcity. Help us to live into your abundance.
As we walk with Jesus on this Lenten journey, let us see your ways more clearly and follow your ways more faithfully.